In 1919, an open space, known as the Jallianwala Bagh, near the Golden Amritsar Temple, would become infamous and a symbol of British oppression in India. At a time of Indian nationalist protest and British oppression, a peaceful gathering at the Jallianwala Bagh would end in the murder of hundreds of people. Anywhere between 350 and 1,500 people are thought to have been murdered in the space of just a few minutes by the British Army. In today's video, we will look into the events leading up to the massacre, the aftermath, and what it meant for the future of Indian nationalism. It's important to understand the reasons why the British were occupying India to comprehend the motivations of those involved. The story can go back as far as 1599 with the founding of the East India Trading Company by a group of merchants and investors in a small dockside pub. We will not go into too much detail as this deserves its own video, but it's at least helpful to understand a bit of the background. Wealthy merchants and businessmen pooled their wealth in a bid to create a company which they hoped would be able to rival those operated by the Dutch and French. The venture was supposed to trade cloth and spices, though initially had greater success acting as pirates and stealing from more established foreign trading companies. Eventually, the company was able to establish fortified trading companies, the first being in Madras in 1626. As a relatively new entity, the company was held in low regard by the Mughal lords in India. Eventually, the East India Trading Company was able to leverage power, build up an army, and exploit the fragmentation of the Mughal lords and fading French influence in the 18th century. The company would extract massive profits from the Indian people, both by buying their wares and selling British-produced goods, often with coercive practices. The East India Trading Company would eventually lose its domination over India following the Indian Rebellion of 1857, otherwise known as the Sepoy Mutiny. One of the key causes was that the Muslim and Hindu soldiers feared the company was in the process of converting the population to Christianity. A rumour then spread that the newly issued cartridges for their Enfield rifles were greased with pig and cow fats. As the cartridge had to be bitten before loading, this would infringe on the soldiers' religious beliefs. Entire companies of soldiers rebelled, killing the British officers and civilians. The British forces responded in turn. Reports of torture with hot irons and chili powder applied to the eyes of captives were commonplace. After the rebellion was quashed, the British government passed the Government of India Act 1858, which stripped the East India Trading Company of its powers. Whilst the infrastructure established by the company was to remain, the British government formed the Indian colonies. In addition, Queen Victoria issued a decree that her new subjects were to be granted rights and protections similar to those enjoyed by the subjects of the British Empire. Following the rebellion, many Indian nationalists instead looked to other avenues to progress their aims. In 1867, Canada was granted Dominion status, meaning there would be democratic processes and a greater amount of self-governance, while still maintaining close ties with Britain. The creation of the Indian National Congress as a force for change and represent the rising middle classes in India can be seen as an example of this new desire. A new British Indian Army was formed following the mutiny. Many of the soldiers were conscripted from the Punjab region, as the British believed these to be the perfect soldiers, honour-bound and dutiful. Whilst this was voluntary in principle, becoming a soldier was often the only choice for many young men. At the outbreak of the First World War, Indian soldiers formed a large part of the war effort, with many hoping their loyal service would help in the progression of self-governance. Around 60% of the recruitment for the British Imperial Infantry for the war would come through the Punjab region alone, specifically a heavy recruitment of Sikhs, who was seen by the British as the perfect martial race. These soldiers fought on every front from France to the Middle East, serving with distinction. The Defence of Indian Regulation Act was passed to grant emergency powers to deal with any subversive movements in India that might threaten the war effort, akin to the Defence of the Realm Act passed in the United Kingdom. When the British Empire emerged victorious from the First World War, it still found itself in multiple crises that would seek to transform its empire. Between unrest in Egypt, Ireland, and Mesopotamia and the start of the Third Anglo-Afghan War, this was a major time for change in the British Empire. Despite their vital role in the war, many in India feared that any promises made for self-governance would not be kept. But shortly after the war, Secretary of State for India Edwin Montagu and the Viceroy of India, Lord Chelmsford, drafted a document recommending a number of reforms. These Montford reforms suggested that whilst most matters would remain with the British, education, health and local government should be handed over to the Indians. In addition, it called for greater representation in the higher councils, but never to be a majority. Whilst seen as a step in the right direction for some, many of the returning soldiers felt betrayed that the promise of self-governance had been broken. The governor of Punjab, Michael O'Dwyer, and many Anglo-Indians believed that the Indian populations were not yet ready for the guiding hand of the British Empire to be withdrawn. As well, of course, fearing for the loss of their power that would affect them socially and financially. The Hindu-led Indian National Congress and the Muslim League had united in their shared goal of self-governance and fought for better representation. In India, the repressive wartime measures were kept in place, and economic difficulties resulted in widespread disenchantment among the population, most notably the Punjab region. Gandhi had recently returned to India following his advocacy for Indians in South Africa and had started his civil disobedience movement against British oppression. For example, in 1918, Gandhi led a successful protest against tax rises in the Kedah district of Gujarat, which were put in place even during times of famine and disease. In a bid to stop the growth of nationalist protests and the limit of Gandhi's civil disobedience movement, the British authorities passed the Rowlet Act. The British were fearful that a repeat of the 1875 mutiny was likely, and so any movement was treated as potentially seditious and murderous. The Rowlet Act was seen as the solution that came into force in March of 1919. It gave the British government the powers to arrest any person suspected of terrorism and detain them for up to 2 years without trial. Freedom of press and freedom of speech evaporated as trials were conducted without juries and meetings between groups were banned. It resulted in many prominent Indian politicians such as Muhammad Ali Jinnah resigning from legislative councils. Gandhi and his followers carried out a number of strikes around India in what became known as the Non-Cooperation Movement. Muslims, Hindus and Sikhs all came together in opposition to the act. The Rowlet Act was seen by the middle-class Indians as a betrayal, one that would be fought against. Anti-Rowlet Act groups exploded into existence. Gandhi was banned by Governor O'Dwyer from entering the Punjab region, which resulted in peaceful protests in Amritsar. The two leaders of these protests, Dr. Saifuddin Kichlu and Dr. Sayapal, were arrested and deported on the 10th of April 1919. This lit the flame for even further protests, with tens of thousands taking to the streets. The British garrison, fearing violence, opened fire, sparking riots and killing dozens. 5 British people lost their lives and many others were injured, most notably a missionary named Miss Sherwood, who barely escaped with her life. On the 11th of April, General Reginald Dyer was summoned to Amritsar to deal with the rioting. Dyer was born in India and had spent most of his life there, with very little time spent in Britain. He was not the typical upper-class officer, having come from a middle-class background, and had little in common with the usual officers who served in India. However, he still believed that the British had a divine right to rule India, and was a firm believer of strong discipline to keep the Indians in line. It is believed he held little regard for the Indian civilians, especially those who dared to rise up against their supposed betters. Rumours abound that the Punjab government was about to fall, many of these rumours coming from the upper-class Indians, fearful that the rioting and calls for the British to leave would be a detriment to their way of life. On the 12th of April, a proclamation was made stating that any damage to British property would be dealt with in the harshest of terms. Any gatherings of more than 4 people were prohibited and would be dispersed by force if needed. A curfew was put into place to be strictly enforced. Posters detailing those new restrictions were plastered on walls in some areas of the city, but not all. On the morning of the 13th of April 1919, Dyer climbed aboard his car with a column of soldiers. He made a series of speeches reaffirming the ban on gatherings and called for a return to normal. Dyer received intelligence that a meeting was going to be taking place at the Jallianwala Bagh, in brazen defiance to his orders. This meeting, however, presented a unique opportunity to Dyer, eager to reassert British authority. He selected a particular group of soldiers, with British officers left at the garrison. The soldiers selected were those that Dyer believed would obey his orders without question, bringing only Gurkha and Balak. There were no Sikhs, no British or Punjab soldiers that were included. He feared that these people would likely disobey the orders. He boarded his armoured car that was mounted with a machine gun and led the soldiers to the Jallianwala Bagh. At the centre of Amritsar lies the Golden Temple, Harmandir Sahib, one of the holiest sites for the Sikh religion. Jallianwala Bagh is located just a few hundred metres from the temple and is a large open space. It is a walled area with only one large entrance, but with a few alleyways. Around 20,000 men, women and children had gathered on that day, as it was the Baisakhi festival, a spring festival which attracted people near and far. Many others had gathered to listen to politicians speak against the arrest of political leaders against the Rowlet Act. Upon arrival, Dyer was confronted with the gated entrance, too small to allow access for the armoured car with a mounted machine gun. This was perhaps the only saving grace of the day. Dyer dismounted and led his soldiers through. He was greeted with a far larger gathering than he had anticipated. Within barely a minute, he had organised his men into firing position in front of the main access point. He then ordered the shooting to begin. No warning was given, no time was taken to appraise the situation, just immediate gunfire. As crowds fled in terror and attempted to flee through the narrow alleyways, a greater mass of people trying to press through presented a greater target. Dyer ordered that his men fire into the larger groups as to cause as many casualties as possible. Many attempted to lie on the ground or hide in the corners. Others attempted to scale the walls to escape the carnage. Some people jumped into the well, landing on top of one another. As people squeezed through the narrow exits, people were crushed to death as they attempted to flee. The shooting did not stop until all the ammunition brought was spent. In total, 1,650 bullets were fired into the crowd of civilians, resulting in anywhere from 350 to 1,500 men, women and children killed. Dyer quickly ordered a withdrawal, leaving behind the injured and dying, with no regard as to how many had been killed. The curfew was soon to start, and Dyer would later lead his men around the city in a further show of force. Dyer did not return to that area that night, but those left at the park were assisted by those willing to break the curfew to help in whatever way they could. Amongst them was Rattan Devi. Her husband went to Bagh earlier that day. When Rattan heard of the massacre, she went looking for him. Unfortunately, she found his body lying in a pool of blood with many others. As she took him into her lap, she witnessed others searching for their loved ones. All the while, she would hear people crying out, asking if they had seen their loved ones. With the help of a Sikh man, she was able to move her husband's body to a different location, and there she would spend the night amongst the cries of the dying and those who had lost someone. The next day, Dyer exerted his control over the city. He made it very clear that the British government was prepared to go to war and that peace only an option through obedience. Dyer sent a message that it was time for the Indians in Punjab to learn a moral lesson. This is the consequence of fighting against British rule. Martial law was imposed by Governor O'Dwyer. This enabled suspected protesters and dissidents to be deported from Punjab. The street where the missionary Miss Sherwood was attacked was subject to restricted access. Any Indian who wanted to pass through had to crawl on their hands and knees in atonement. Following the massacre, Edwin Montague ordered a full inquiry into what happened. Montague was, by all accounts, deeply disturbed by Dyer's actions. The Hunter Commission was established with British and Indian lawyers involved in uncovering the truth. However, no victims or their families were interviewed. Dyer was summoned to justify his actions. When questioned, Dyer defended his decision by stating, "Call it what you like, I was going to punish them. My idea from the military point of view was to make a wide impression throughout Punjab. I wanted to reduce their morale, the morale of the rebels." Dyer insisted he fired due to the fear of his soldiers being overwhelmed by the thousands of civilians at the park. He presented that he had a difficult choice between mutiny or by shooting the crowd. In fact, he was adamant that such a gathering at the Bag presented opportunity to suppress a mutiny and save India from widespread revolt. It is important to note that there was no evidence that there was a planned insurrection. The protests in Amritsar were focused on the oppressive Rowlet Act and the arrest of those leading politicians who opposed it. Dyer was made to retire in 1920 and spent the rest of his days in Britain. It was reported that he struggled to sleep and spent the rest of his life justifying his actions on that fateful day. Dyer died in 1927 from a stroke. To this day, even the mention of the name Amritsar is linked to the massacre. It is to this day a vital event for Indians to remember their struggle for self-governance and the sacrifices of their forebears, with the many thousands visiting the site each day. The actions of General Dyer must be seen through a lens of how the British colonial forces approached the rule of India. The concept of divide and rule, utilising the existing Hindu caste system and religious differences, had its successes. But during the 1875 mutiny and during the oppression of the Rowlet Act, unity amongst many groups was something that could not be tolerated. When Dyer spoke of breaking morale of the Indian people, it was to prevent any nascent notion of coming together to oppose British rule. Before 1919, many Indian nationalists were content to slowly acquire dominion status and obtain increased representation in government. The lesson that was ultimately learned was that the British did not see their Indian subjects as to be trusted, nor as the equals initially decreed by Queen Victoria. The focus was shifted to other methods of resistance to British rule, with the goal of independence firmly in their sights. In 1920, Gandhi wrote to Viceroy Chelmsford, and in the letter, he stated he was no longer willing to cooperate with the British, and instead would increase the mass non-violence resistance that was taking hold, citing the massacre at Amritsar as a key reason. The massacre at Jallianwala Bagh was a major turning point for the Indian nationalist movements, and one that galvanised much of the population behind the likes of Gandhi and Jinnah, who were instrumental in the push for Indian independence. The massacre lays bare the contempt and distrust pervasive through the ruling British classes of India, and the lengths that men like Dyer were willing to go to maintain power. Visits to Jallianwala Bagh by British politicians have taken place, and whilst regret for the event was stated by the Prime Minister Theresa May on the 100th anniversary, The British government has not issued an official apology for the massacre. I would invite you to look further into the massacre, as it is one of vital importance as to the legacy of British imperialism and the fight for Indian independence. Freedom of protest and speech, as well as the right to a fair trial, were all stripped from the Indian populations in a bid to cling to power. The hundreds of unarmed peaceful people who were murdered to act as a warning to others must be remembered. There are some that view the victims of the massacre as martyrs to the cause of independence. Whether the case may be, the murder of these people marked the end of the British Empire in India.